To leap from an aircraft with only the thinnest film of nylon to break the fall requires unique courage. The airborne soldier must not only overcome the unnatural act of the jump, but also be prepared to fight once on the ground. Fort Benning, Georgia. These young men and women have just completed jump school at the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division. They are proud to wear the wings of the paratrooper and join an intensely proud fraternity of individuals. Being airborne cuts across national lines. They feel a comradeship with the airborne of many nations. There hasn't been a strategically significant parachute assault for more than half a century. Yet the very name airborne still evokes awe in the military world, and for good reason. Airborne designated soldiers are the best trained forces available to any army. The essence of their training makes them the best. It is very intensive and demanding, both physically and psychologically. Paratroops must learn split-second timing. Teamwork is critical. The physical act of dropping hundreds of feet through the sky and then fighting an enemy demands stamina. Because airborne forces are designed to operate independently behind enemy lines, the individuals must learn to be resilient and self-reliant. There are no long logistical trains of support for the airborne forces. Airborne forces know they are among the best. They have great esprit de corps. This alone gives them an edge in battle that few other combat forces can draw upon. For these reasons, it is the airborne forces that are usually first to deploy when the threat or reality of combat is present. The airborne forces of the world all share this common bond. Their aim in life is to place themselves in harm's way, and they do this without hesitation. Part of their fierce pride derives from the proud and bloody history of airborne forces. Even adversaries have a respect for one another. It was certainly not always this way. In the beginning, few officers in the British, French, or American armies took the concept seriously. The first recorded parachute drop was made in February 1912 by one Albert Berry, who jumped at an American army base. No one took particular note of the occasion. Shortly thereafter, the Great War ensued. Military planners in Europe concentrated their efforts in the great slaughter of trench warfare. The modern parachute did evolve in the war. Army balloonists were able to parachute back to Earth if in danger, but initially, the Royal Flying Corps didn't issue parachutes to their pilots, lest any be tempted to literally drop out of a fight with the Germans. Yet the idea of airborne forces had taken root. The French, Italians, and Russians all dropped small teams behind enemy lines. An American colonel, Billy Mitchell, later to earn the wrath of his superiors because of his support of aviation, did suggest a mass drop on the German garrison at Metz in 1918. His suggestion would be prophetic. The war ended before the concept could be tested. The immediate post-war years in Europe were hard for Germany and Russia for different reasons. Germany had been defeated and was under the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Russia had undergone a chaotic revolution leading to a communist government. New solutions to old problems on many fronts were necessary in both countries. The Soviets had the problem of trying to build a new empire. Civil war raged in Russia until Lenin gained near total control. The army the communists inherited from old Imperial Russia was old-fashioned and inflexible. The Soviet Union was a huge country, and utilizing airborne units was a logical military move. German military observers were particularly impressed by a Soviet exercise in 1931. The paras themselves crouched like stuntmen on the airplane wings. being dragged clear by the slipstream after pulling their ripcords. Still, it was a method of delivering many men and specially designed air-mobile supplies across a long distance quickly. The Soviets eventually were able to conduct 1,000-man drops. This was a tactic that would not be ignored. The Soviets turned to airborne forces out of necessity. The new leaders in Russia recognized their own backwardness and saw the necessity to take radical action militarily to be able to catch up with the West in terms of pure armed force. One of the new strategies adopted was the theory of deep battle. This envisioned small groups of men deployed by parachute far behind enemy lines in order to cause chaos and pave the way for the main body of troops to arrive by glider or transport aircraft. German advisors helped the Soviets and developed even more sophisticated airborne practices. With the Nazi takeover in Germany, aviation became a focal point of rearmament. The Nazis started a youth program to develop flyers of the future. A cadre of young pilots emerged capable of handling the aircraft that could easily be converted from civilian to military applications. September 1939. Blitzkrieg. German forces moved rapidly to conquer Poland. No German airborne forces would parachute in these early battles. They were hardly needed in any event. But Hitler was still bluffing. He could not handle an aggressive move by the Allies in the West. The race was on to determine who would strike first on the Western Front. The Allies moved into Norway to be ahead of the Germans. They were too late. Hitler moved more decisively using his new airborne forces. Although outnumbered 5-1, the Germans outmaneuvered the British, French, and Norwegians. The Nazis only jumped on selective targets, such as airports, but this was enough to capture the initiative. They were followed by German air mobile forces, which poured onto the seized airfields, followed by German fighters and bombers. These tightly coordinated actions would prove to become classic airborne techniques. The battlefield was extended. German air units harassed British and French moves to reinforce Norway. The Allies had not learned to deal with the fast-paced German air operations. With Scandinavia secured, Hitler could look west against the main bulk of British and French forces. The German airborne troops would again play a critical role. The Dutch thought they were protected by their neutrality, the French their Maginot Line. The British felt their army was better than the Germans, and the Belgians had their string of frontier forts, and their fortified strong point at Ebon-Emil, at the junction of the Albert Canal and the Meuse River. The German plan was simple. Regular Wehrmacht troops would invade Holland to draw Allied forces north. Meanwhile, German panzers would break through the Ardennes to the south, in a great pincer move that would trap the British and French. The fortress at Ebon-Emil stood in the middle and would have to be taken quickly. Again, the highly developed German airborne tactics would come into play. On the dawn of May 10th, 55 German paratroopers, carried aboard gliders, landed on the roof of the seemingly impregnable fortress. The 700 Belgian troops inside were trapped. The Germans had trained extensively for this exercise. Each man knew what was expected of him. Sappers raced among the gun emplacements to place explosive charges. Flamethrowers were brought up against others. Stukas dive-bombed the fortress, causing more damage and sowing confusion. Again, coordinated attacks proved the worth of airborne forces. German reinforcements attacked the perimeter of the fortress. The Belgians were being assaulted from within and without. Other paras attacked bridges in the vicinity. The fighting was bitter. Individual Belgians resisted valiantly, and the Germans were still thin on the ground. A determined, well-planned counterattack would have succeeded, but none came. Within 2 days, the battle was won by the Germans. The Nazi offensive against the Dutch utilized conventional forces moving across the frontier, but the main attack came from the air. Leaving the Dutch army behind in defensive positions, the German paratroops, who had practiced and trained for years, now would show the world what airborne forces were truly capable of in battle. over 10,000 paras from 2 German airborne divisions would drop. The port of Rotterdam was a main target. The airport and outlying sections of the city were quickly taken. Dutch resistance was strong, but the element of surprise was in favor of the Germans. Their ground forces now raced across the Dutch countryside to make contact with the paratroops. Holland was doomed. The German paratroops seemed unstoppable. Across the Channel, Britain prepared for an airborne assault. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister as the assault on Ei-bar-Amil was taking place, was quickly learning. He ordered a British airborne force created. Early in 1940, John Roth of the Royal Engineers was detailed to take charge of the fledgling organization. And that was about the extent of his brief. With no policy or task to guide him, Major Roth and his Air Force colleagues under Wing Commander Morris Newman set about training volunteers from No. 2 Commando at the newly created landing establishment at Ringway, today the site of Manchester Airport. Although Churchill's orders gave the new force the impetus it needed, resources were in short supply. They had no parachutes, and the hard-pressed RAF could only spare 3 aging Whitley bombers. The whole operation was one of trial and error. Jumping techniques were refined to enable the paratrooper to have his chute deploy automatically with the aid of a static line as he jumped through a hole in the fuselage of the aircraft. This was a strip of canvas attached to the ripcord on the inside of the aircraft. It proved to be safer. It deployed the canopy automatically as the paratrooper left the aircraft rather than have a dispatcher pull the ripcord. It was to remain the standard technique for many years after the war. Jumping through a hole in the floor was not without its risks.
If you weren't careful, you caught the parachute pack on the side of the aperture, which tilted you forward. You bashed your nose on the other side, and it was called ringing the bell. So there were a lot of people about, budding parachutists, with injuries to their noses.
The type of clothing worn by the paratrooper also changed. To begin with, the paratroopers wore a bulky padded oversuit, copied from the Germans. It was soon realized that this was an impractical item of clothing once the paratroop soldier was fighting on the ground, and so the distinctive smock was developed. This was worn over the standard combat uniform and is still worn today. The paratrooper's head was protected by a helmet made of cork and rubber until replaced by a steel helmet. British paratroopers jumped without a reserve chute, and the preferred jumping altitude was approximately 500 feet. This meant that the paratrooper was only in the air and at his most vulnerable for some 7 seconds. The combination of training and parachuting was enough to weed out unsuitable volunteers. Soon the airborne forces began to attract a special kind of soldier.
The standard of the soldiers. This business of having to jump out of an aircraft provided an automatic selection procedure. If he was prepared to do that, then surely he then had the potential to be a really good soldier. And nice people, too, and a delight to command later on. No, I was fascinated with this fact that this one act of parachuting, or perhaps qualifying after 7 or 8 jumps, was enough to select out or to knock out those who were unlikely to make good soldiers.
By November of 1940, 500 men had qualified as military parachutists. No. 2 Commando had become 11 SAS Battalion. It was now time to mount a combat mission. The entire battalion volunteered for the 38 places available on the specially formed X Troop. The objective of Operation Colossus was to destroy the Trigino Aqueduct in southern Italy.
I think the main aim of the Trigino raid was, although we thought at the time it was to stop the water supply to the Italian bases in the south of Italy, but in practice it was really about discovering whether we were competent or clever enough to mount a parachute raid at all. And we'd flown out from England, landed in Malta, and from there took off and landed about 4 or 5 hours later, as far as I remember, in the mountains of southern Italy. And then, soon after we landed, within about 3 or 4 hours, we blew up the aqueduct, but unfortunately, all of us were then taken prisoner.
Dean Drummond, seen here in a picture taken by the Red Cross after his capture, had no intention of spending the rest of the war as a prisoner. Eventually, he made it back to England after escaping a second time, disguised as an electrician. His unwillingness to be defeated would serve him well later in the war. As fate would have it, at the time the British were mounting their first experimental operation, the Germans were preparing for the most dramatic airborne assault of the war, the capture of Crete. British forces had withdrawn to the island after their defeat at the hands of the Germans in Greece. RAF bombers could still strike at Nazi targets throughout the eastern Mediterranean from Crete's airfields. While the Germans were weak in amphibious capability, their airborne was more than proven by this point in the war. Hitler approved a plan to conquer Crete by air, a move designed to quickly remove a major roadblock on the road to mastery of the entire Middle East. It would prove to be a prize with a severe price. Troops landed by parachute, glider, and air transport, all on one single day. The Germans were actually outnumbered by Commonwealth troops, but they did have the advantage to surprise. The blazing sunshine and heat was nearly as deadly as was the British defense. The attack was not smooth, and the Germans faced chaos from the moment they landed. The British put up a heroic fight, but the Germans and Italians controlled the air. The defenders were ultimately doomed, and the British had to endure yet one more withdrawal, so they could fight yet another day. The Germans paid for victory with blood, with more than 3,000 men dead and as many wounded in the olive groves and scorched landscape of Crete. Such attrition was unacceptable to Hitler. He said that he believed the days of large airborne assaults were finished and vowed not to undertake another one because the element of surprise had gone out of the shock of using parachute forces. He did not realize that Crete was a great airborne victory in spite of the relatively high casualties. The Americans were shocked by what they considered the success of the Crete operation. They had just taken the first tentative steps towards creating an airborne force when the Germans showed how powerful massed airborne assaults could be. The Americans studied captured German combat films closely. They realized there were many lessons to be learned from what the Germans had perfected to a better extent than any other military at the moment. They would apply these techniques at Fort Benning, Georgia, where, in 1940, a small test platoon had been established. These men, like the British, had no firm guidance on how to establish a parachute army. Every technique and rough training procedure had to be created from scratch.
So that started off, they had 48 men and 2 officers to form a test platoon. We didn't know anything about it, they didn't know anything about it. Nobody had ever ridden an aircraft, seen a parachute jump or ridden an aircraft when we went and started jumping. Didn't have no big aircraft, they had to bring some in. Had a little bitty observation ship flying around, and 2 guys peeping out over you.
Equipment was improvised. The men wore off-the-shelf old-style American football helmets for protection. Unlike their British cousins, the Americans got to carry reserve chutes when they trained. America was not yet at war, and losing young men in airborne training was not what the infant service needed. The Americans also differed from the British in using high towers for initial drops rather than from static balloons. Still, the effect on the men was the same. If they could handle these drops, along with the other rugged training, then they were more likely to make it as regular paratroopers. the recruits considered themselves special.
From the first day I got to Fort Benning, which was the training ground of the Airborne, I never had cause to doubt that the Airborne was 100%, because those guys are rough and tough and hard to bluff, you know. And anytime you didn't like the looks of somebody's face, you were free to try to change it. And you know, nobody would hold it against you either. You just you were your own man, and you could go as far as you wanted to go and do the things you wanted to do.
The test platoon was successful enough for the Americans in September of 1940 to order the establishment of their first regular airborne unit, the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion. America might not have been fully ready to go to war, but she did have a cadre of trained men willing to go. The American para's famous jump cry was adopted in these early days after one trooper was told he would be too afraid to remember his own name when making his first jump. He instead shouted the name of an Indian hero in a film popular at the time, Geronimo. The paratroopers alone could not make an effective airborne assault. They would need supplies, reinforcements, and heavy weapons. In the early 1940s, these could only be provided by the flimsy glider. The men of the glider forces were the unsung heroes of airborne operations. In these early days, the Americans didn't even give glider pilots the right to wear wings on their uniforms. The bulky and awkward British horses and American Wacos would supply the backup for the paratroops. The gliders were towed aloft typically by bombers or by C-47 Dakotas. In optimum conditions, they were released a few hundred feet from their landing zone and plunged, literally in controlled crashes, to the ground. The pilots had very little maneuvering ability, and one problem was finding enough open space to land. The urgencies of war meant some gliders were built by casket builders. Inevitably, gliders earned the nickname flying coffins.
Flying gliders was just as difficult in training as it was in combat, and we lost, I don't suppose, as many glider pilots in training as we did in combat, but we came close to it. And the American Air Corps of that time, later became the Air Force, had really uncut diamonds in these men that were able to fly gliders. And I don't believe that they ever really perceived what they had. A lot of the glider pilots were men who had learned to fly in small country airports. And when the war came along, they had this ability to fly and training, and they wanted to use that ability. And they wanted to fly. But the Air Force of that day had stipulations in which you had to be a certain age, you had to have certain physical qualifications, and in many cases also educational qualifications. And a lot of the glider pilots were not able to pass those. For example, if you were past 25 in age, they didn't want you to go into flying. They wanted you to do something else. So a lot of these men were in their 30s and wanted to do something for their country, so they volunteered to fly gliders. It was the only opening in any type of flying that they were able to do. So they gave them that choice, and they took it.
The luckiest pilots would be the first on the ground. Those in later formations found the landing zones crowded. Balance was critical. Since they were often loaded with heavy equipment in the rear, landing gliders could easily nose over, bringing instant death to those inside from the cargo ripped free from its restraints. In addition to equipment, the gliders also carried infantry. It was a tough way to go to war. Pearl Harbor meant the United States would now join the global conflict. the small American Airborne Corps were greatly expanded. By July 1942, 2 airborne divisions had been organized, the 82nd and the 101st. Both generals and enlisted men quickly had to change their approach to war, and infantrymen became airborne troops. Meanwhile, in Britain, the newly formed Parachute Brigade prepared for further action. In February 1942, the recently formed C Company of the 2nd Battalion took off from their Whitley bombers and set course for the French coast. In perfect weather, they jumped over their target, Bruneval near Le Havre. The objective of Operation Biting was to capture radar equipment in a villa that the Germans had started to use to great effect against the Allied bombers. The force of nearly 200 men was divided into 5 groups, named after great British naval heroes: Nelson, Hardy, Jellicoe, Drake, and Rodney. They were accompanied by a radar expert from the RAF, who had never made an airplane flight before, much less a drop by parachute. Each group had a different objective. On clearing the drop zone, the Drake group was to capture the villa and dismantle the radar equipment. This they achieved with complete surprise. Meanwhile, the Rodney group had been detailed to contain a German unit billeted in a wood some 400 yards away. At first, the German response was slow, and the radar was almost dismantled before effective fire was returned. As the British withdrew to the beach where they were to be picked up by landing craft, they came under increasing heavy fire. It was at this critical stage that the Nelson group would be dropped some 2 miles short of the target, arrive, and with great dash, subdue the enemy strongpoints. Under an intense enemy barrage, the groups boarded the landing craft and met up with ships to take them back to England. The whole raid was a complete success, with almost the complete radar system being captured along with 2 operators. The next operation came 9 months later. It was to be Britain's first glider operation. The operation, codenamed Freshman, was to be an assault on a heavy water production plant in Norway. The Allies were worried at this stage in the war that the Germans were making inroads towards making atomic weapons. Heavy water was a vital component to a nuclear weapons program. 3 gliders, containing 17 men each, took off with their tugs in Scotland. Only one of the tug aircraft returned. It was only after the war that the fate of the rest of the force became known. All had been murdered by the Gestapo. Trujillo, Bruneval, and Norway were all daring and unorthodox examples of the use of airborne troops. And if Bruneval was the only true successful operation, the new air arm had been given something to sharpen its claws on. In August of 1942, the Parachute Regiment was formed as part of the Army Air Corps and given its now legendary insignia, the Blue Wings. The emblem of the airborne forces, Bellerophon, astride Pegasus, was worn by all ranks. The regiment and airborne forces in general was rapidly earning a reputation as an elite corps. Recruits were volunteers from other regiments.
By the time the airborne came into existence in the 1942, the proper airborne, when they started forming divisions, they were regarded as one of the elite units of the British Army, and along with the commandos and the Marine commandos, I always reckon that if you're going to fight a war, then you may as well be in the elite and fight with one that going to be one of the best units, and one that believed it was as good as any unit it was likely to come up against. And I think your chances of survival, although we had a dodgy way of going into battle perhaps in gliders or by parachute, once you got into battle, your chances of survival in many ways were probably better than a lot of the infantry. So yeah, I had no qualms about going into the airborne. In fact, I was sort of eager to get there, and I got in the end of 42 when I was 17 and a half, 18 years. I think I was short of my 18th birthday then.
The airborne appealed to those who wanted to fly, even if they couldn't be pilots. For one recruit, failing one eye test only made him more determined to pass a second.
They said, well, how would you like to become a parachutist? And I hadn't thought about this before. And I said, well, why not? I'll have a go. If I can't be a glider pilot, I'll be a parachutist. So 6 weeks later, I was sent to the Airborne Forces Depot at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. And there we had to have a medical examination to check that we were fit to be parachutists. And I thought, well, this time I'm not going to fail on the ISET. But these tests were not quite as individual as the aircrew medical examination had been, and such that we queued up for the various examinations, and one of these was to read the eye test in chart. And I thought, well, if I'm not careful, I'll be failing again, so I put my glasses on, and by an incredible feat of memory, I don't know how I did it, I memorised the eye chart from top to bottom, joined the queue without my glasses on, and when my turn came, I read it perfectly. It was assumed that I had perfect eyesight, so I passed the medical with flying colours. So that was how I got into the parachute regiment.
Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire became the office depot and first stop for volunteers. The training program was extremely tough in order to weed out unsuitable candidates. The course was designed to instill an offensive spirit, as they would often be dropped into action lightly armed and facing greater numbers. It was this motivation that had seen the paratrooper overcome seemingly overpowering odds through the regiment's history.
The place you went in, Hardwick Hall, we got out to Chesterfield railway station, and there was a company, a platoon of French Foreign Legionnaires, all marching off steady. The outside was a truck, so we slung all our kit in the trucks. We were about to leap into them when a horrible sergeant says, "Where do you think you're going?" "You're marching back." Because these Legionnaires are all in step where we come from different units. Well, anyway, we marched to Hardwick Hall barracks, and there's two gates, the north and the south. And once you got in there for that fortnight, wasn't allowed out off duty. So consequence being, you allocate the huts, and then you running. That's what we do every morning. You go out to PT. They used to have exercises where one platoon would go to one gate, one out the other, and when you meet, the instructors would say, set upon each other, want to see a bit of blood. And then they blow a whistle, and you go past each other, and you come back in the opposite gates.
The next operation was to see the regiment perform in its classic role, landing ahead of and cooperating with ground forces. America had recently entered the war, and the parachute regiment was an immediate beneficiary due to increased numbers of C-47 Dakota aircraft being flown directly from the States. The Dakota was a major improvement over the Whitley, as the paratroopers could leave like gentlemen, through the door. Since 1941, the British had been fighting a seesaw battle for North Africa against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. It had been a battle largely dominated by massed armored units, with airborne units playing no significant role. After the victory of General Montgomery at El Alamein, the tide began to turn. It would be the infusion of American forces, who had been quickly trained in the US, that would allow the final push to victory. The men were anxious to join the battle. In November 1942, combined Allied forces invaded Vichy French North Africa. It would be the Americans, first moving against the Germans. The Yanks' inexperience in warfare would result in tragic mistakes. The first American airborne troops would fly all the way from England to Algeria. They would be in for a surprise.
Everybody was gung-ho. Everybody was ready to go. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We figured that we could take on the whole damn German army. And of course, at the beginning, it wasn't the German army we were taking on, it was the French. Our first casualties came from the French. And that was kind of a shock to most people. Because before we took off, you know, they had two plans, the war plan and the peace plan. And it all depended, you know, on what was what. We were going to jump at night if it was the war plan, and we were going to jump in the daylight if it was the peace plan. And this was November 8th, 1942. Well, we got the signal it was going to be the peace plan. And we were in for a rude shock, because it was sure as hell not the peace plan. It was the war plan. because the French fired on us and shot down 3 planes.
It was not a glorious beginning of the war for the American paratroopers, but ultimately they would prevail. The American and British airborne forces were beginning to work together. Cooperation would be critical for coordinated operations in the future. Each had much to contribute to the other.
So we trained very vigorously with the 1st Airborne Brigade, British. And those guys, they saved many lives on our account. I'll clue you. They were great, absolutely great. And the upshot was, we taught them how to jump out of C-47 planes, and they taught us how to survive in combat.
The Allies urgently needed to rid Africa of the Germans. With Rommel's Afrika Korps defeated, the way would be open for the Allies to attack the German southern flank through Sicily and Italy. This would open the long-awaited Second Front and relieve pressure on the besieged Russians. The attack was pressed. The British Airborne deployed in the early stages of the campaign. The 3rd Parachute Battalion jumped into the vital airfield of Beaune between Algiers and Tunis. Coincidentally, just as the British were jumping, a German airborne unit was en route to the same airfield and had to turn back upon learning the British were already there. The British 1st Battalion achieved a similar success at Souk El Aba, occupying a key road junction at only 90 miles from Tunis. The 2nd Battalion was less fortunate. They were dropped with the objective of destroying an enemy airfield and German equipment on the ground. However, the aerodrome was abandoned. This, coupled with the fact that the 1st Army advance had been held up, meant that the 2nd Battalion was now 50 miles behind enemy lines. Their fighting withdrawal back to Allied lines had all the epic qualities that were to be the hallmarks of the Parachute Regiment's exploits from Bruneval to Arnhem. Lightly equipped and short of ammunition, they arrived back to relative safety, having lost 16 officers and 250 men. Throughout the North Africa campaign, the 1st Parachute Brigade fought more battles than any other formation in the 1st Army, often fighting as infantry. They took 3,500 prisoners and inflicted over 5,000 casualties, at a cost of 1,700 to themselves. Not only did they earn the respect of their army comrades, but also that of the enemy, who christened them Roter Teufels, the Red Devils. The name was taken as a compliment and adopted by all the British airborne forces. At the same time, a Tunisian shepherd corps, Ro Mohammed, became the battle cry of the 1st Brigade and later of all British airborne forces.
They used to say, "Woho Mohammed," and we used to do that. We'd come out these pubs and find that we were being waylaid by a huge great gang, sometimes American. We used to shout at the top of our voice, "Woho Mohammed," and airborne guys, they used to leave their girlfriends, whatever they were doing, leave other pubs, and it was a job to find a pub with beer in sometimes. They'd leave and they'd all come piling in. And these they never got onto it, the Americans. I never understood why they never figured it out, didn't have their own battle cry, because we used to let up this battle cry, and airborne guys had come from everywhere, and suddenly they'd find themselves swamped by airborne. And of course we used to have battle royals then. It used to go on for hours sometimes. We'd have the MPs, they'd leave us alone. They wouldn't even sort of risk getting involved because the airborne were in there. But that was esprit de corps, you know. I mean, one guy only had to shout "Woho Mohammed" in Salisbury, and any airborne man that heard it went straight in. Didn't matter who he was from, what unity, whether he was glider, para, who he was a red berry and he was in trouble, and you went in. And that was the airborne, I think, esprit de corps.
By May, Field Marshal Montgomery could celebrate the virtual collapse of German resistance in North Africa. There would only be a few short weeks before Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, would begin. On paper, taking Sicily seemed easy. there were 10 Allied divisions poised to take on 2 understrength German divisions and elements of 4 demoralized Italian divisions. But along the German lines was the unusual Hermann Goering Division, a sort of personal army of the Nazi Luftwaffe commander. It was both an airborne force and an armored panzer group, a potentially formidable opponent. The British airborne forces were assigned to attack along the western coast of the island, while the Americans were to drop along the southern coast. The amphibious forces would fill the gaps around the Paras. It would be the largest Allied combined paratroop glider operation to date in the war. It nearly proved to be the last. It was slated to be a nighttime operation. Planes and gliders filled with men and equipment launched into the night sky and over the invasion fleet. The nervous Allied gunners took dim aim and fired on their own. Allied planes fell from the skies. Worse still, many glider tow planes dropped their lines in the confusion, dooming nearly 80 gliders and more than 250 men who were left to crash into the sea. For the men and aircraft that did get through, the nightmare was not over. Winds of 35 miles per hour blew the paratroopers wildly off course. Many scattered so widely as to become ineffectual as fighting units. Individual soldiers did manage heroic acts against the Germans, but the lack of a cohesive assault resulted in many more casualties than necessary. A British brigade had been slated to land by glider to capture a key bridge. Only 83 men out of 2,000 from the airborne force got close enough to press the attack. But that they did, and they won.
We arrived out in North Africa, that is the 2nd Brigade and the Atlantic Brigade and the divisional headquarters. And we came out and accepted, of course, and the 1st Parachute Brigade, reinforced, resupplied with all the soldiers that they needed now, and they were, again, the first people to drop on the Primacole Bridge in Sicily. Unfortunately, it dropped all over the place from Etna. And I believe one airplane went on a 180-degree wrong course and landed in the middle of Africa somewhere. But mostly they did land, and there was, in fact, one company, about a company, that actually captured the bridge and held it. And that was the end of that story. But it showed how it is absolutely essential to land, if not actually on the objective, as close to it as you possibly could. This was the lesson that was completely forgotten and not undertaken at all at Arnhem.
The night after the debacle of the first attack, a second wave of airborne troops was sent in. Unbelievably, these men were also attacked by Allied ships.
The sky lit up like the 4th of July, like the Hudson River. I mean, traces everywhere. You see planes going down. We later learned that the final total was 23 planes into the drink, crashing into Sicily, and there's a record of about 3 planes that actually turned back to North Africa.
Paratroops could at least jump from their crippled planes, but there were more than 300 casualties resulting from the mishap. In spite of these setbacks, the airborne forces that did make it into the fight were able to disrupt German communications and generally harass enemy troops rushing to reinforce beachhead defenses. This was the fog of war at its worst. Ironically, because the airborne force was so widely dispersed, the Germans didn't really know what was happening.
This created confusion in the enemy's mind, because no matter where he looked, he saw, little guys, but he had no idea that this was the sum total, 3 or 4 guys. And then maybe 5 miles away, he had 3 or 4 guys. So it added, to the good that this happened, However, it didn't happen. It wasn't good for the poor bastards who got shot down.
At one point, German airborne reinforcements jumped on an airfield in the midst of an Allied jump. Chaos and blood was the order of battle all through the island. Ultimately, the Allies pulled together, and the Germans withdrew. Even as the battle for Sicily was winding down, the Germans proved they were still capable of bold moves. In late July, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was removed from office. The embarrassment to Hitler was acute. Mussolini was held in virtual arrest by the Italian government at an alpine mountain resort. Hitler dispatched elite airborne commandos to land in gliders on the hotel lawn. They surprised the Italian guards and swept Mussolini back to temporary safety in Germany. It would be one of the boldest airborne operations of the war. The action was clearly evidence of the utility of airborne troops in hostage rescue. It was still tough going for the paratroopers. For the first time in the European war, the American airborne forces were successfully doing what strategists had hoped for, able to act as shock troops in initial fighting and then settle in as very competent infantrymen. The Sicily campaign had the effect of sorting out American command and control problems. This was sustained warfare, with the Germans fighting increasingly closer to home. Casualties were high, but the Paras were soon back in action. In September 1943, the Allies invaded the Italian mainland. Airborne forces were not planned to be a part of the operation, but the attack at Salerno bogged down in the face of stiff German resistance. In a daring move, Allied paratroops were called directly onto the embattled beaches. The paratroopers had dropped into a cauldron. Big German guns were able to rain fire down on the lightly armed men. The Germans were able to cut the Paras off, but only temporarily. The troopers would not give in.
As it turned out, you know, in my estimation, and many others feel the same way, it was a beautiful, beautiful mission. We had it all our own way. The Germans didn't know where we were, and we knew where they were at all times. So we held them up absolutely, completely for one day. They could not reinforce their beachhead. The defense of the beachhead, that is. Whereas we went down, we blew bridge. We'd see them setting up, you know, an 88 gun position. That night we'd go down there and knock it out. It was beautiful, it really was.
The Americans were able to fuse their lines back together and advance on Naples. On October 1st, the city fell, much to the joy of the inhabitants. The advance through Italy began in earnest. Town after town was liberated. The ensuing winter made tough going for the airborne soldiers. Instead of planes, the Paras used mules for transport. Yet the very versatility of the airborne forces once again proved their worth in battle. Victory was not without a cost. In one of the great and longest battles of the war, the German 1st Parachute Division defended the town and abbey of Monte Cassino. For many weeks, the Germans stubbornly fought off attacks from the Allies. The British, American, Polish Commonwealth troops simply could not break the German line. This tenacious resistance would severely disrupt the Allied drive through central Italy. Massive bombing attacks by Allied aircraft only added to the problems of the ground troops, as the rubble left from the bombardment would hamper movement by tanks and other vehicles. Monte Cassino would have to be won by men moving from wall to wall, rock to rock. The British Second Para would remain in Italy throughout the long campaign. For the British, like the Americans, this was a frustrating and bloody experience. As they advanced up the mainland of Italy, they found the German destruction of bridges a major impediment to movement. It was decided to mount a 60-man airborne assault well behind enemy lines. They were dropped by 3 Dakotas in daylight at Torricello. Dummies were dropped along with the men to confuse the Germans as to the real size of the operation. The small British force managed to tie up a German division for weeks. Its presence would have been invaluable at the front. In the Italian hills, the 82nd Airborne linked up with the British 8th Army. This was the last action for the 82nd in Italy. It was time for the final great push on Europe. British and American airborne forces withdrew from battlefronts to go to England and prepare for the invasion of Normandy. One combat team remained in Italy for one final operation, the invasion at the resort town of Anzio. This was fighting reminiscent of the First World War. It was intense and personal combat. In some places, it was literally trench warfare. The veterans of the battle well remember the conditions.
Cold, muddy, miserable, sitting ducks, which is exactly what it was. We had them looking right down our throat at all times. They were sitting up there in the Elbin Hills. Could see all our movements and everything else. And we were out on the point. There's a section called Carano. And it was a bulge in our line. We could only have one company up there at a time. And depending upon the action, we relieved them at least every 2 to 3 days. We'd rotate the 3 companies up there until that one push that they wiped out our B company. But we took it the next day. We went back up there again. But it was bloody hell, no matter how you look at it. Absolutely miserable.
While the fighting dragged on in Italy, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets were deploying their airborne forces in huge, near-suicidal 10,000-man jumps against the Germans. These attacks did little to alter the strategic situation. But harassment behind the lines did tie up the Germans. Again, the value of airborne forces in well-planned tactical moves proved valuable. In the early spring of 1944, the Allied airborne forces settled in for a few days of relaxation and many weeks of hard training, preparing for the Normandy invasion. This time would be the high point of airborne power and influence in World War II, and perhaps their greatest moment in history.